Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, August 10th, 2022. And today I know a lot of people are really outraged at the FBI specifically and the DOJ more generally. And this is either going to end up being what most things end up being, and that is a partisan campaign tool to bludgeon another team and absolutely nothing more. Or we can do some leadership here, all of us together, and help people look further beyond the current outrage of the day and help them see that the DOJ has been harassing and abusing millions of people for a long, long time. They've been violating the Constitution and your liberty almost constantly. And so on this episode, I'm going to share with you my top 5 issues with the Department of Justice. It was hard to keep it to just top 5. But before getting to that, I want to say a quick hello and a huge thank you to everyone for joining me here today. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. I can't thank you enough. But let's say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while we allow people another moment or so to join us here on the live stream. There's Richard in Kansas, Chariton in Missouri, Tim Martin in Arizona, Brian in Georgia, Dave Simmons from here in SoCal. Land of the free, right? Dixie Strong in Alabama, Sharon Patriot, good to see you. Nome DeGuerre, Ozzy Crosby in Bangor, Maine, Erwin Havernick in Omaha, Clay Kent, Poet Fisherman in Iowa, Too Tall, Gun Eye in Missouri. Jay Armstrong says FBI's fumbling, bumbling idiots. I wish they were just dumb. Maybe some of them are, like a Keystone Cop, but they're very dangerous. They're very dangerous. Haji in Southeast Michigan, and everyone else. There's Lauren Smith. Ula Tinsley, good to see you, Ula. Matthew in Louisiana, and I know I'm missing a few, but I really appreciate you guys being here. I will look through the comments a little bit later in the show, see if there's any comments or questions I can get back to. Otherwise, I do read them throughout the day or so after the broadcast is done, and that way I get a lot of ideas for future episodes. And your comments also help trigger the algorithms of these mainstream platforms and tell them to show us to more people. It actually helps out quite a bit. So let's get right to this. And I want to first mention that if you want to follow along with all the stuff that I'm talking about, I'm going to be linking to a few other episodes and some other information for you to check out on your own time later on, because I'm just scratching the surface here today. You should follow us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That's our show homepage. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. You can find all the archives of the show, all the other platforms we're on, in case you notice we happen to get booted from your favorite one some point in time, which is going to happen. And then in each episode, I publish a blog post for each episode about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done, and you can find a whole section with show links, all the stuff that I'm referencing, so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. Let's start out with this. Here's a tweet from the 10th Amendment Center yesterday, and if you are on Twitter and you're not following the TAC, you got to get on that right away. It's at 10th Amendment. But here's our view on this. If you only oppose federal power when it's wielded by one political team against your political team, you shouldn't be surprised when you live under the largest government in history, because they don't just get this power to wield these agencies, these bureaus, these, I don't know, tools of oppression, I guess we could call them, really, against their opponents out of nowhere. It's because they have so much power in the first place, and once you establish that precedent, tyrants are going to use it in ways you don't like. But if we don't go beyond just the campaigning and the partisan hackery of the day, then things will never change. And we do live under the largest government in history, and it's only going to keep getting worse. So the Department of Justice has this nice, handy organizational chart of all the different things that they're involved in, all their different agencies and programs. I will link to that in the show notes. I'm going to be working off of that a little bit today. But let's do a countdown of my top 5. And these could change over time, but this is my feeling as of today. And I think they're all kind of connected in one way or another. And number 5 for me is mass warrantless surveillance, because the FBI, it's not just the NSA or the DEA, which we're going to talk about in a few. The FBI runs some of the biggest warrantless surveillance programs that exist. And warrantless mass surveillance 100% violates the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. It shouldn't exist. It violates your liberty. It violates the Constitution all over the place. It's bad stuff. And one of the worst ones that the FBI has is this thing called the Next Generation Identification Biometrics Database. If you're into future sci-fi, it's happening today. And here from Electronic Frontier Foundation, the NGI database expands FBI's IAFIS criminal and civil fingerprint database to include multimodal biometric identifiers such as iris scans, palm prints, face recognition, ready photos, and voice data, and makes that data available to other agencies at the state and federal level. So they collect a lot of this stuff, if not a vast majority of it, without a warrant. They use it as tools to monitor and track people, their political opponents possibly. I mean, certainly if they're not doing it now, they have the ability to do that. And we shouldn't be surprised when it's not just against the big, famous, powerful people, but it's really against everyone and against you for having the wrong viewpoint, for going to the wrong rally or the wrong church, or purchasing something to defend yourself and your family. They're keeping track of all this stuff. And the more ways that they can track and trace you, the more ways they can chill your activities and control you. And here from Wikipedia has a pretty good overview of the NGI system. The FBI, they say, first used this system back in February of 2011. February 2011. The system was developed by Lockheed Martin. So this whole system is built by military contractors. It is a military tool. It is a weapon of war that they're using on the population in partnership with a French military contractor, which is a company called Safran. I had to look that one up. And with a number of other technology companies. By 2012, the database had 13.6 million images, representing 7 to 8 million individuals. So in just 1 year, they got up to about 8 million people, 16 million images by mid-2013, and over 100 million by 2014. We could guess that it's somewhere around 70 million people that they've got in this database as of 2013. Now, according to the FBI, it actually is the largest biometric surveillance database of its kind on Earth. And they brag about this on their website. You can look it up if you'd like. Here from Signal Media, they talk about how they're now expanding this beyond just the standard tracking and tracing. They're now running a full-scale, as of last year, the FBI has been running a full-scale iris print ID service, eye scans, as part of its next generation identification system, or NGI, for almost a year. So since 2020 or so, they've been running this iris scan program to expand it. So let's say when you go to the airport or you're going into a public area, whatever, they can just scan people's eyes. It's like out of a movie. Anyways, I covered a lot of this surveillance in an episode last fall. The top 9 ways they track, trace, and monitor you. It's not just the FBI. It's not just the DOJ. And certainly we know, since the FBI is sharing this warrantlessly collected information with state and local law enforcement, they're turning these law enforcement agencies on a local level, peace officers, into tools of a national surveillance state. And that's bad news. So I will link to that episode over in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. You should check that out. That's number 5. Number 4 is civil asset forfeiture. And then here from the Department of Justice, they say the primary mission of the Department of Justice asset forfeiture program is to employ asset forfeiture powers in a manner that enhances public safety and security. They don't say anything about following the Constitution or ensuring that, no one's property is taken unless they've actually done something wrong. It's just about for your safety. And if we never forget this phrase, for your safety really means so we can control you, we'll be far better off. Here from Institute for Justice, which is the best organization on earth when it comes to civil asset forfeiture. And here's their description of it. And this is important to understand. I'm only going to go through this briefly, but you should read through this link, which will be in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty once I publish that blog post. With civil forfeiture, they say, property is on trial, not a person, meaning the government need only demonstrate property's link to a crime, not its owner's personal culpability in that crime. This is in contrast to criminal forfeiture, which requires prosecutors to prove both the owner's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, a far more difficult proposition, and the property's connection to the crime. So what they're doing is it's basically legalized government robbery. They're charging property. There's actually court cases out there like government of whatever state or federal versus a Chevy Silverado. And IJ actually highlights some of these things. They're actually charging property with a crime. This is flipping due process on its head, because if they can just take your stuff and never have to prove that it was involved in the crime, they never have to prove that you, the owner, were guilty of something, they're just stealing from you. And governments at every level actually use this system. Some of the states have actually instituted some pretty strict restrictions on this. But unfortunately, the federal program is actually there to do an end run in many ways, an end run around any state level restriction on civil asset forfeiture. And here's how IJ describes the federal equitable sharing program. They always give it these nice names, like Patriot Act, right? War on terror. They're not. It's a war on you. Anyways, federal equitable sharing. It sounds nice and friendly and all that, but really, it's really nasty stuff. And they put it this way: even in states with better civil forfeiture laws, I like how they don't say good or great, but just better or less bad, innocent people can still lose property to forfeiture. That is because, so even if a state totally banned the state from doing civil asset forfeiture, there's this federal program, and the feds hang this out in front of law enforcement, and IJ will explain how this works. That is because the federal government offers a giant loophole called federal equitable sharing. It allows state and local law enforcement agencies to partner with federal agencies to seize and forfeit property under the federal government's permissive laws and receive up to 80% of the proceeds regardless of state law. So what they do is they say, well, in this state, we're restricted from doing civil asset forfeiture. It's against state law to do this. But, that's some cannabis. Or that's a firearm maybe the feds don't like. Well, we're going to call our federal partners at the DOJ and tell them that we have a federal case here. And suddenly, they become federal agents. They're deputized. They work the case locally, and they get one federal agent overseeing it. Then they steal the stuff, even though the state law says they can't. They hand it to the feds take it, and then they distribute 80% of the proceeds back to the local law enforcement. So it's an end run even around state-level restrictions. And the previous administration actually loosened up the rules on that to make it far worse, or try to. So this goes across party lines for sure. Civil asset forfeiture is really nasty, especially the federal one. And here from IJ, they say by handing over seized property to the federal government, state and local law enforcement agencies can harness the litigation power of the feds and circumvent state laws that provide better protection to property owners or direct forfeiture proceeds to a neutral account. I did an episode covering this federal equitable sharing program, and would you be surprised that this thing started back in 1984, and one of the lead sponsors of it was a certain senator from Delaware who happens to live in the White House today. This dude loves ripping people off, loves the drug war, loves gun control, and loves stealing people's property and mass surveillance. It's really nasty. Anyways, one of my biggest issues with civil asset forfeiture and with equitable sharing is that it's actually a financial incentive to turn local law enforcement agencies, local law enforcement agents into federal ones. Like, we don't need the founding generation. They did not create a national police force because they didn't want that kind of centralized control. They wanted all the powers, the police powers is what they call it. That doesn't necessarily mean police as of today, but generally the wide swath of powers that weren't delegated to the federal government specifically in the Constitution. They wanted all those things to be dealt with individually on a state-by-state basis as the people of each state decided. And so this type of thing, this equitable sharing, this asset forfeiture program, it pushes local law enforcement into a national police force, which is dangerous. And that brings me to number 3 on the list, which is a national police force through federal joint task forces, federal grant programs, through the Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Assistance, which you can see up here on the screen if you're watching. And they say BJA provides leadership, services, and funding to America's communities by emphasizing local control. Now, this might be the biggest piece of propaganda on this page here. It's hard to actually compare them all because there's so much garbage out there when it comes to the Constitution and your liberty. But it is pure propaganda to claim that federal funding to local agencies, local communities, local law enforcement, local governments is about emphasizing local control, because with federal funding comes federal strings. And here's how Mike Meharry described this when it comes to creating joint task forces and a national police state in an article a couple of years ago. Through the proliferation of joint law enforcement task forces, the federal government is creating a national police force that operates in a legal twilight zone with little or no oversight. Law enforcement officers from various state, local, and federal agencies make up these task forces. The concept, and what a surprise, evolved from good old President Nixon and the unconstitutional war on drugs, and the first ones started in the 1970s. A lot of the local law enforcement agencies back then, they didn't want anything to do with it. They're like, what? With federal money comes federal control. Now I think they realize with federal money comes more power. So they don't care about having federal control as long as those agencies can do more stuff. Now, one of the biggest programs that they use to actually do the federal funding of local police, turning local police into a national tool, into a federal agency, is something called the Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant Program. It's the JAG program. It may not be the number one largest. I think maybe the Department of Homeland Security has a bigger one, but it's pretty close. This is billions and billions of dollars. And much of the funding is actually to get local police to focus on federal enforcement priorities, like the war on drugs or federal gun control, which is also a war on you. And both of those programs, the war on drugs is actually a tool to do federal gun control, and federal gun control is also a tool to do federal drug control. So it's all tied together. And they love making your law enforcement into something other than peace officers. And one of the interesting things, it's important to note that when locals join these federal task forces, just like with the civil asset forfeiture program, they're immediately deputized. They're automatically deputized. And maybe they go through a process. I don't actually know. But they are deputized as federal agents. So then if there's stronger restrictions on their activity on a state or a local level, they're no longer bound by that. Sorry. I'm actually working for the feds right now, and I know you guys are paying me for this, but I'm still working as a federal agent, and they're helping us out, keeping things safe, but they're no longer bound by any restrictions on their activity, whether it comes to enforcing gun control or the war on drugs or civil asset forfeiture or surveillance. Like if they have to get a warrant on a state level, the feds probably don't do that because they water everything down on a federal level, which is one of the reasons why I don't like the courts forcing all kinds of good stuff on the states, because at best what we get is a watered-down version of it, but that should be another episode. Anyways, I covered this whole nasty joint task force thing in a episode a little over a year ago, state federal task forces and the national police state. There are literally hundreds of these, and most of them have to do with drugs and guns. And they claim it's for terrorism and to protect us and all this stuff. But what they're doing is they're protecting their own power, they're expanding their power, and they're attacking our liberty. So that was number 3. And that leads me to number 2. And that is the DEA, also part of the DOJ. And I don't think it's possible to go through all the different ways that the war on drugs is a war on the Constitution, a war on your liberty, and ultimately a war on you. But they have already spent well over $1 trillion on this since Nixon declared it back in the 70s, about 50 years, $1 trillion. And of course, they have to steal that money from you in order to restrict your liberty through mass warrantless surveillance programs in order to catch people. The foreign policy adventurism. There's a lot of examples of that. Civil asset forfeiture is a tool of the war on drugs. So is nationalizing local police, a tool of the war on drugs. And gun control is a tool of the war on drugs. One of the biggest things that we find resistance when we work to get state and local law enforcement to stop participating in federal enforcement of federal gun control, stop working with the ATF. We saw this happen heavily in Missouri and a number of other states where we see legislation moving forward, whether it ends up passing or not. One of the number one complaints by law enforcement lobby groups is that they like using federal gun control charges as a force multiplier for, well, drug charges or vice versa. And so these are very intricately combined. They're tied together, and the war on drugs has long been a tool of gun control. I covered some of the many ways that the Constitution is getting destroyed by the war on drugs, and here's how it was described in that episode. Few programs have done such consistent and sweeping damage to the original legal meaning of the Constitution as the so-called war on drugs. Unfortunately, many of the people who are against the ATF, who are currently against the FBI, they have no problem with the war on drugs, even though it does all of these other things combined. In many ways, I wanted to put this as number one, but I think that might be a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow, because my number one today, at least, is the ATF. And here, if you're looking on the screen here, I've got this nice image that we should post on our socials soon. Disband. That's the only thing that the ATF is constitutionally authorized to do. It should not exist, just like most of these other agencies. But if we look at this quote from Mercy Otis Warren, the muse of the American Revolution, she said, "Self-defense is a primary law of nature, which no subsequent law of society can abolish." And if you think about that, the very existence of the ATF is a violation of your natural right to self-defense, because they are there to enforce gun control, period. So these people really should get a job doing something better. But all the stuff they enforce, none of it should exist, not one. If you think about it, there's a whole wide range of this, and they keep trying to add to it until we start taking the position that the ATF itself shouldn't exist, that all federal gun control is unconstitutional. We shouldn't be surprised that each successive administration tries to ramp it up and make it worse. We've got things like the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 1968, its amendments in 1986, the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, the bump stock ban of 2018. There's new regulations that are on the way this summer and in the fall, and I know they're going to try to do more and more and more. And it's all really bad stuff. Now, ultimately, we really have to go beyond, when it comes to the FBI, the DOJ, we have to go beyond the current political outrage of the day and understand that most of these federal institutions, these agencies, these bureaus, these programs are violating the Constitution and your liberty almost constantly. And that's probably an understatement. Now, nothing helps us get that kind of message out to more and more people every single day than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us today for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, that's all spelled out as well, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And I do want to take a quick moment to say a huge thank you to just a handful of people. I haven't done this for a couple of weeks, and I apologize for that, because I really, really appreciate it. Whether it's just $2 or $200, whatever it may be, don't feel pressure to do it. But if you're able to kick in a little bit of fiat, we will spend it fighting against the empire every single day of the year. And I want to say thank you to a few people who have joined us lately. There's Gino in Tennessee, Vern in Arizona, Sherry in New York, Michael in Minnesota, Lynn in Texas, Travis in Arkansas, Matt in California, and Julie in California. Again, I really, really appreciate you guys. And if you want to join them, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'm curious what you think. If any of these top 5 shouldn't be there, are you okay with any of them? Hopefully you're not, because if you're already here following the 10th Amendment Center and trying to support the Constitution and liberty, you absolutely can't stand any of these agencies, bureaus, or programs. You don't like centralized power and control. You want to see liberty expanded. And this is one of the big reasons, if you think about it, one of the big reasons we work so hard every single day to get states or local communities to opt out of helping federal agencies do federal stuff. We primarily focus, for example, on the ATF, the DEA, the NSA, for example, federal surveillance programs, or the DEA's license plate tracking program, they actually are tracking people for the crime of driving. Millions and millions of people. They were doing this for years before it was leaked by Reuters, of all people, a number of years ago. So they're on about a decade of doing this. We learned that most of the tracking data that they get is shared with them by state and local law enforcement agencies. So if they stop sharing that data, they can't actually do the tracking program. So it's things like this that has to happen against virtually every issue. We also had legislation that we were working really hard on. We still do, but there just doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in it lately, to turn off resources to the NSA. We got this passed, there's a loophole in it. We got it passed in California. It needs to be fixed. What they did was they figured out somehow that, and this is my mistake for trying to get too much done in one piece of legislation, but we drafted it so broadly here in California a number of years ago that it actually would have required the state to turn off electricity and water to every FBI and DEA office in the state as well. They passed it, but it needs something to actually go to implement it. So we want to actually stop helping federal agencies violate our rights, have the people of the states exercise their sovereignty, their final authority, because that's how it's supposed to be. We're never going to get government to limit its own power. It's really ultimately going to be up to the people and the states to reject, resist, and nullify all of it. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. Let me take a look over in the chat and see if there's anything interesting here. Ula says, am I the only one who thinks you'd be a great addition to the Daily Wire? I'm not familiar with them, but I really appreciate that. Hopefully well, I like to think that when it comes to the Constitution and liberty and strategies on how to defend both when government refuses to do so, which is constantly, I'd like to think that there is no one that can even come close to the work that we do here at TAC. Vincent says, TAC chapters in every state working to help disband federal programs. That would be cool. Tom Casey says it's up to the states. God help us. Certainly, the states are tools of the central government. But ultimately, when we're talking about the states, we're talking about the people of the states certainly have to lead. Because it doesn't matter if, let's say you get a state like Missouri to stop helping in the enforcement of federal gun control. And the ATF absolutely hates the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act. The DOJ is currently suing Missouri to try to force them to continue helping the ATF. They're already severing some of their relationships in these joint task forces with the ATF. But ultimately, it's up to the people. Because if everyone still follows the federal gun control laws, it doesn't matter whether they enforce or not, because there's nothing to enforce. So ultimately, all of this gets down to we the people learning how to exercise our rights and having the courage to do so, whether the government people want us to or not. And Tom, you're right. Tennessee is bad for nullification, has no stomach for it. A lot of times they claim to do something good, but when you go through the legislation, it's absolute garbage. We see this in a lot of states. Anyways, let me take a look and see if there's anything else I can respond to here. Sharon says safe is a relative word. Certainly, they want to make sure, they want to tell us they're helping us be safe. But when it comes to safety from a founding perspective, we can only truly be safe when we're free. And the only way we can get towards freedom is when the people start demanding and refusing, demanding they follow the Constitution and refusing to go along with things when they don't. Again, which is constantly. Anyways, I will look through a little bit more of the chat later on today and tomorrow. Please continue to leave those comments or a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. Subscribe, get notifications. All that stuff does trigger those algorithms and helps us reach more people. We're getting out to more and more people than I ever thought possible. I started this kind of as a hobby 4 years ago, and I really love doing this and sharing this kind of information with you. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you on Friday here on the Path to Liberty.